This episode of Trifles is brought to you by listeners like you, who support us on Patreon and Substack.
To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the cyclist was solitary, the bachelor was noble, and the resident was patient, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? On which 3 continents did Watson have experience of women? When did 221B Baker Street first get telephone service? And why does Holmes prefer telegrams over writing?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 404, Bohemian Alternatives. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
Are you the alternative Burt Wolder?
Yes, I'm the optional Burt Wolder. I come with the paperback version and the corrected proof, and also a change of shoes.
You can never be too careful out there. Well, that's important when you're wading into matters like this. This is going to be an interesting episode. It's one that was suggested to us by Debussy's Boat. At least someone with the email handle Debussy's Boat. We don't know who you are.
No, but we know a lot about Debussy's Boat because there is a river cruise ship named the Riverside Debussy. It has 55 suites. It's bright, it's airy, it offers butler services in every suite, premium wines and spirits, Starlink, broadband, Wi-Fi. And it's all for you, folks. Just find it online and sign yourself up.
I knew I had a sinking feeling. This is an episode where we're going to look into a what-if scenario. What if things didn't work out exactly the way Sherlock Holmes had planned them in a scandal in Bohemia? We'll get into the specifics there in a bit, but it's going to be interesting to kind of consider this alternate reality. You know, if it were a choose-your-own-adventure, how would it have ended? We also do have a drawing. It is our monthly drawing for all of our supporters from Patreon or Substack. At the end of every month, we do a drawing for a free back issue of the Baker Street Journal. So you'll want to stay tuned for that. See if you won, if you happen to be supporting us. And if you're not, you can support us simply by following the link in the show notes or going directly to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com. Pick the option that works for you at what level you'd like to support us and go from there. Okay, well, before we get into the topic here, we did have a little bit of listener mail from Bob Hanmer. Bob wrote in to comment on our Fateful Voyages episode. Remember, we talked about those transportation issues that there were in the canon, those that ended tragically. And Bob said, I started listening to your episode 402 on my walk this morning. I paused the episode and considered where voyages were mentioned. I focused on sea voyages, so I missed your bicycle, wagon, and train journeys. But I think you missed a sea voyage and the epilogue of The Valley of Fear. There's the cable from Mrs. Douglas. Jack has been lost overboard in a gale off St. Helena. No one knows how the accident occurred. Just thought you'd like to know what I found. I'm certain I'm not the only one to point out this omission. I think this is the first time I thought of a reference that the two of you had not mentioned on the show. I thought it was an excellent episode. But then they're all great. Sincerely, Bob Hanmer.
Oh, thank you, Bob.
Yeah, and I'm not at all surprised we didn't mention that.
No, but it's a great addition.
Yeah, very astute to point that out. Yeah. Well, speaking of astute at pointing things out, we did get a suggestion for today's episode from Debussy's Boat, thinking about a scandal in Bohemia. Now, the whole premise of a scandal in Bohemia was there was a photograph that was being held by Irena Adler. The king of Bohemia wanted Sherlock Holmes to get a hold of that photograph, make sure it never saw the light of day, lest it ruin his portending marriage. And what ended up happening in that story, Bert?
Well, what ended up happening? Well, Holmes concocted a scheme based on his assessment of Irene Adler's judgment, bringing to bear his own, shall we say, insights and prejudices about female behavior. And that's really what we want to examine. He makes a series of assessments, and these come up to us in the conversation he has with Watson. In Scandal in Bohemia, talking about the photograph, he says it's most unlikely that she carries it about with her. It's cabinet size. And we'll come back to some of these prejudices and insights. But he constructs a scheme, engages Watson's help. Irene Adler, believing her house is on fire, shows him the location of the photograph, and quite confidently he leaves the scene, certain that the next morning he'll be able to return and recover the photograph.
And that was, in fact, not the case, as he was trailed home that evening by an Irene Adler in disguise as a young man, wishing him good night on those steps. He showed up the next day and found, as he opened the secret hiding space, the photograph was not there, but instead there was a note addressed to Sherlock Holmes, one that explained to him that she was on to him, but that he had almost gotten away with it. This was kind of a fascinating admission, I thought. She said, well, you really did it very well. You took me in completely. Until after the alarm of fire, I had not a suspicion. But then, when I found out how I had betrayed myself, I began to think. I had been warned against you months ago. I had been told that if the king employed an agent, it would most certainly be you. And your address had been given to me. Yet with all this, you made me reveal what you wanted to know.
Well, but the question here is really, what was Holmes's plan? Because Debussy's Boat, now, by the way, we should mention that we would love to send a prize to Debussy's Boat for suggesting this topic. All we need is contact information.
Yes.
From Debussy's Boat, as soon as you put into port, of course. But that's really the question. Did Holmes account for all possible scenarios? What if she had been hiding the photograph outside her house, in the garden, or on the second floor, if there was a second floor in the house? He couldn't have followed her around the house or out the door without blowing his cover immediately. So what were his other plans? And that's a really good question. The whole thing is really based on what I referred to earlier as his prejudices and insights. And in the conversation with Watson, he points out, as we just said, that the picture is large, so she can't be carrying it around. Watson says, well, she can't carry it around. Where could it be? Holmes now goes through all the possibilities, her banker, her lawyer, but I'm inclined to think neither. And here's where his prejudices and insights come through. He says, women are naturally secretive, and they like to do their own secreting. Well, that's a pretty blanket statement. Why should she hand it over to anyone else? She could trust her own guardianship, but she couldn't tell what influence might be brought to bear upon somebody else. And he says she wanted to use it in a few days, so obviously it must be where she can lay her hands on it. It must be in the house. And then, she's been burgled, but they don't know where to look. And Holmes says, I will get her to show me. And of course, then we have the great plan with the smoke rocket.
Well, just as an aside, I prefer, if I need to do any secreting, I prefer to be the one who secretes. So,
me too.
It is
rather than the secretee.
It's a personal kind of thing, isn't it? Yeah. So the plumber's rocket, which this is a device that plumbers would use in pipes, and it might be in gas pipes, it might be in water pipes, but what it does is it is about the same or smaller diameter than a pipe itself. It's inserted into the pipe in one end, and the pipe is sealed off, and then it emits smoke. And if the smoke happened to seep through any cracks or other ways of entry or exit of the pipe, then the plumber can determine where he needs to make a repair. And in colloquial terms, a plumber's rocket, if you were to look for a plumber's rocket these days, it would simply be a smoke bomb. So Holmes has Watson send this plumber's rocket in through the window, and the smoke starts emanating. And what does Irene Adler do? She naturally assumes that the house is on fire. She makes a move for the area where she's hidden the photograph, and there we go. So Holmes explains, he said they carried me in. She was bound to have me in. What else could she do? And in her sitting room, which was the very room which I had suspected, it lay between that and her bedroom, and I was determined to see which. They laid me on a couch. I motioned for air. They were compelled to open the window, and you had your chance. Okay, so let's pause there. The sitting room. This is a public room. It'll be on the ground floor. Holmes said it was between there and her bedroom. Now, I don't know if he means the choice was between the sitting room and the bedroom, or if he meant physically that it was between that room and her bedroom, like on the way to her bedroom, like as if the two might be attached. Right? It's not clear what floor her bedroom was on, if that's the case.
Yeah, it's a little vague in terms of Watson's writing here. But what Watson says earlier is that Holmes was born into Bryony Lodge, and laid out in the principal room, which I still observe while I observe the proceedings from my post by the window. So Watson sees him in the principal room. So I tend to think that his comment there, when he says into her sitting room, which is where he was brought, which was the very room which I suspected, it lay between that and her bedroom. I think he means the location of the photograph he assessed would be either in the sitting room or in her bedroom. And I was determined, and they laid me on the couch, and I motioned for air, and they opened the window, and, and then there we go. And then, we have the explanation of how he gauged Irene Adler's actions. A married woman finding her house is on fire grabs at her baby. An unmarried one reaches for her jewel box. There was nothing more precious to Irene Adler than the photograph, and so she would rush to secure it. And she did it in an instant, and he catches a glimpse of it. But the question is, what would happen if she had just rushed into the bedroom and closed the door?
Right.
Or rushed to some other part of the house? He couldn't have jogged after her. Really, it's an interesting question.
That's exactly it. And I mean, he must have somehow put himself in her shoes, metaphorically speaking, thinking that the sitting room would be the most likely place. Could it be, almost like the purloined letter kind of thing, where it is in the most obvious place, the most public room in the house, that she would put it there rather than in some sort of more personal chamber where she thought it might instantly be looked for? This thing of value. Holmes spent a lot of time talking about her motivation or her instinct, a woman's instinct for what she would go after. A married woman, her baby, an unmarried woman reaches for her jewel box. In this case, the most valuable thing she had was the letter, or the photograph. That's fine, but he doesn't explain the psychology behind which room she chose and why it had to be that one.
Well, you could imagine that of all the rooms in the house other than her bedroom where she slept, she would be spending most of her time in the sitting room and then derive some comfort from knowing that the photograph was right at hand. So you can sort of imagine that. But it's an interesting question. I
wonder, though, if she spent a lot of time in the sitting room, as you say, and would be in the photograph's presence, I wonder if she took it out on regular occasions and stared at it, admiring her bravery, her willingness to pose with the king. Maybe some happy memories of the time that the two of them had together, a reverie of sorts.
Yeah, and why is it she didn't have a photograph of Godfrey Norton that she could be gazing happily on?
Wouldn't that have been something if she replaced the photo of her with the king with one of Godfrey Norton and left Sherlock Holmes with that instead, and no note? That would have been hilarious.
Well, Holmes. It would have been great. Holmes is always doing things like this. You could imagine if Watson had a little more dialogue here. He could have said, Holmes, but what was your plan if it wasn't in the sitting room or in her bedroom?
Yeah.
Holmes would wave his hand and say, oh, well, I had 7 different approaches to I had 37 options that I had identified ahead of time.
I had 7 more plumber's rockets in my pockets. Is that a plumber's rocket in your pocket, or are you just happy to see me?
My next strategy, Watson, would have been a simulated earthquake.
And barring that, I would have just run around the house like a maniac. Well, it does pose an interesting conundrum. How the story might have evolved differently if the hiding place were somewhere else, or if Holmes had different plans. But well, it's something to consider. Meanwhile, why don't we consider our lucky winner for the free back issue of the Baker Street Journal? All of our supporters from Patreon and from Substack are eligible for this, so your names go on a list here. We're going to give the big prize wheel a spin. And it is slowing down to land on number 53. 53, and that looks like it is Miles Clower. Yes, congratulations. We'll get a copy of the Baker Street Journal off to you post-haste. If you'd like to be like Miles, then just make sure you go to trifles.substack.com or patreon.com/trifles for more. Well, I think that is the only trifling information I can come up with this time, Bert, unless you had more.
Well, if we had more information, it wouldn't be a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
You can close that drawer. You have made the wrong diagnosis, Doctor. I have my stimulant here.